Hey guys, what's up? This is Mackenzie Criswell here, and today we're going to be taking a look at processing raw image sequences. Okay, so in my After Effects comp here, I've got a nice raw sequence imported. This is a time-lapse shot on a Canon T3 at a little bit over 4K, and then put into a 1080p sequence. This is, of course, shot raw. You can tell by the enormous file size, and I want to do a quick video showing how to process these types of images. They're very large and have some interesting capabilities. So if you've never done it before, you might not have a full idea of what you can do with the raw images. We're going to be going over how to use these image sequences in both After Effects and Photoshop, especially Photoshop because it does not by default actually work with CR2 raw files. So we have to do an interesting workaround to be able to import those. But we're going to start off in After Effects and just talk about camera raw and how to use raw sequences. If you're going to be doing time lapses a lot, you're probably going to want to get After Effects. You can do it with Photoshop. You're going to be limiting yourself quite a bit with what you're able to do just because of the fact that Photoshop does not do raw sequences by default. But you know, it's possible. It just kind of removes the capabilities that RAW really has. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I've got here. I've got a nice image sequence, CR2 image sequence that I shot quite a while back. It looks pretty nice except for the grass moved and stuff about halfway through. Someone walked in front of it, and the cup actually moved a little bit through the frame too. So it's not a usable time lapse. So you know, I can use it for tutorials and stuff without having to, I don't know, it just seems like a good idea to use it for the tutorials. I will be putting this sequence up for download. It's pretty enormous. It's about 5.2 gigs, I believe, the entire folder, so I'm going to be converting the actual sequence to 1080p JPEG, but I will include a select few raw frames, probably 4 or 5, maybe a little bit less raw frames for you to actually mess with. But the rest of it will be JPEG. But you will have access to this image sequence, you know, if you want it. So let's go ahead and import these image sequences into After Effects. So in After Effects, it's really easy to do. You just come over here to your project and hit Command-I or Control-I, respectively, whether you're on a PC or a Mac. I like to just double-click. It's a nice shortcut, and it's universal via operating system. And you can select the first image and just make sure camera raw sequence is selected. You can also select them all, but you only have to select the first one. Just make sure camera raw sequence is indeed selected and you'll be good to go. Now, whenever we click open with After Effects, well, first it's actually going to tell me I'm missing frames, but it's going to open something called Camera Raw. And this is a really cool kind of mini application built into both Photoshop and After Effects, and it allows you to work with raw sequences in a very interesting way. Okay. Now, there's a lot of disadvantages and advantages to shooting raw, and we're going to take a look at both of them right now. The first obvious disadvantage is the humongous file size, and that's probably the biggest disadvantage for most people. But the biggest advantage for most people is that you're actually able to get a lot more latitude with the image. While normally you'd have a fairly flat exposure with a digital camera, you actually are almost able to get the latitude of film when you shoot raw. It's obviously not an equivalent. Film is going to give you, you know, an entirely different look than digital, but it's getting closer. Now, the cool thing about RAW is you're actually able to under or overexpose your image if it was shot incorrectly, overexposed or underexposed. Up to, you know, 5 stops is as far as it goes. Workably, you're probably not going to want to go over about 2.5 or 3 stops, but it is possible. So I'm going to go a little extreme and bring this down actually 3 stops and say I really want this to be dim. And I'm going to try to bring up the shadows and blacks, and I'm actually able to almost get a really dim workable image. I'm going to bring up the whites, and it's going to be difficult to do, but we can almost get a workable image. This would of course take some work, but we can get a workable image underexposing 3 stops, and it's pretty crazy that you can do that. So we're going to go ahead and just default these back and go ahead and underexpose correctly. Now this particular shot isn't necessarily overexposed. It is for my purposes. I definitely like to bring it down at least a half a stop. I'll go ahead and do a whole stop here in Camera Raw since I do have that capability. And I'm going to bring up the shadows so I'm not getting that really weird dark tone. And that's great because you have a humongous amount of latitude to the image. I'm also going to go ahead and bring down the highlights so I get some more detail back in the trees. I could bring down the whites, but I'll just leave them as they are. Probably, yeah. Okay, so this is the coolest thing about RAW, is the latitude. And this is why you're definitely going to be wanting using After Effects for image sequences if you would all have the possibility, because when you're using raw image sequences with Photoshop, you actually lose this capability. And you're just treating the raw sequences like a JPEG sequence. Photoshop can handle raw images one at a time, but 24 times a second is a little much. So if you're going to be doing raw time lapses a lot and you really need the features of raw, you're definitely going to want to download After Effects. It's part of Creative Cloud, so it couldn't possibly be easier to get now. But it's basically a really great way to get your image started before you even import it. Now, I actually like to do a lot of other things to the image before I import it. One thing I really like is clarity. With this particular image, I also brought up the saturation some to bring in some of that orange color that looked really nice, as well as some of the green and the grass. Of course, you're going to have to adjust everything respectively to what you're doing. But this is a great start to our image. It almost looks like it has a grade already. Of course, we'd probably grade again once we got in here, but here is our image sequence imported. I'm going to go ahead and create a new comp that's 1080p and the length of our composition, and just drag this in. And since it's 4K, we've got a lot of room to work, but our image has been processed. It's in After Effects. It looks great already. We could render like this, or we could do adjustments. We have a full class program here to do basically anything we want with it, and but that's how you would go about processing raw images inside of After Effects. We're going to go ahead and do this in Photoshop real quick. Like I said, Photoshop does not process CR2 image sequences by default, but I have found a sort of workaround to do so. And I wanted to show you, it's not necessarily the best idea, but it is possible. So let's go ahead and fire up Photoshop real quick. Okay, so once we're inside of Photoshop, basically we're going to want to get this image sequence in here. And I'll go ahead and show you what would happen if we were to try to import the image sequence. So if you know how to import videos inside of Photoshop, you're going to want to just create a new document to start editing, and then choose layer, video layer, and new video layer from file. Now, normally you would just go to your folder with the image sequence, select the first image, and hit open. Photoshop, however, is not going to be able to do this because it's not going to natively be able to work with those CR2 images. So basically the process I've come up with is taking the CR2 images and converting them to JPEG. Not the best way to go about doing things, but it's about the best we can do. So let's go ahead and open up one of these CR2 images and create an action that will allow us to do this. So we're gonna have to basically ignore camera raw, so set everything to default. For whatever reason, the clarity and the vibrance don't reset, so you just have to go in and manually change those all back to 0. So we want to ignore camera raw completely and just open the image inside of Photoshop. Now, once we're inside of Photoshop, we're going to want to go ahead and use the exposure control here to create an action that will allow us to underexpose all the images. At least half a stop. We're probably not going to want to go farther than that, since we're not actually able to take full advantage of RAW. We are going to do some interesting things with the curves effect after we get all the images ready to still be able to use this sequence, but we're not going to be able to get the full capabilities of RAW, which is why you're really going to want to use After Effects if you're doing time lapses. But basically what we're going to do is come up to Scripts and choose Image Processor. Now, I've gone ahead and created an action that will underexpose these, and I'll just actually show you how to do that really quickly. It's very easy. We come up to Window, choose Actions, create a new action. We'll call this underexpose. And as soon as we hit enter, it's going to be recording by default, so any changes we make are going to be recorded and applied to every image in the sequence. So, image, adjustments, exposure, and we're going to underexpose about half a stop. Woo, negative 0.5, not negative 5. And you can see already it's not going to be working the way we want to. We're going to get some very nasty looks, and we're going to be able to fix this more or less with curves, but you're really just not going to be able to get the full power of the HDR format. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK, and then just stop this recording and go ahead and set up our batch script. We don't have to save the image, probably don't want to. So we'll come to Scripts, Image Processor, and go ahead and set this up. I'm going to select our original folder as the source for our images, and then create a new folder called JPEG as the destination. I'm resizing them all to 720p just because that's an easy format to work with. And then under Preferences, you're going to want to go ahead and run that action we just created called underexpose. You would go ahead and then hit run, and it would open every single image, shrink it down, underexpose it, save it, and do that 300 times. I've gone ahead and done a few frames though, not all 300, so we can go ahead and work with those. So to actually get the image sequence in, you just create a new document, just like you would to normally import a video in Photoshop. Layer, video layers, new video layer from File. Come out, we're going to grab that JPEG sequence now. As you can see, we've got a couple of frames here. It's about 30, 60, 70 something frames. And we'll just select the first image. We can't actually select anymore, so select the first image. It will know it's an image sequence. Go ahead and import it. We can see the layer thumbnail here. Now you would normally set the resolution to the same as the photo. But this is just a little bit taller than 720p, so it's not a big deal. We'll just leave it as it is for right now. Of course, you would actually probably crop the image to fit this. That'd actually probably be the better idea. But what we're going to do to try and fix this in Photoshop is come up to Image, Adjustments, and Curves. You can also use levels, I just prefer curves. And what we do to try and recover the detail we lost is bring up the highlights a little bit actually, and bring down the midtones. So it's not a great solution, and there's really not a great way to go about working with CR2 image sequences in Photoshop, but we can try and get pretty close. So this is almost as washed out as it was before the HDR, but we were able to maintain a little bit of detail. But that's how you would go about editing these CR2 images in Photoshop as a time-lapse sequence. I hope you've learned something interesting from this tutorial that you can apply to your work. But I'm Mackenzie Criswell, and I'll see you next time.